Good afternoon, everybody. It's Amy Dacey, the Executive Director of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics here at American University. We're so glad you could join us this afternoon. We have a very special guest that's joining us to talk about the global pandemic and coronavirus and its implications both domestically and internationally. I consider him a friend, certainly Joe Hockey, who is the former ambassador from Australia to the United States. Joe, if you don't mind, I'm going to give a little background so people know all the amazing things that you've done and all the expertise you're going to bring to the conversation. And then we can get into some questions, and we hopefully will be able to leave some time at the end so the audience can ask some questions as well. But former ambassador, so you did ask, I'm supposed to call you honorable, is that correct? Or
you can call me whatever you want within reason.
I love calling you honorable, but it's great to have you here. Joe, I know that now you're the founding partner and president of Bondi Partners. We're very interested to hear a bit about your new work. But one of the incredible things is you did serve as ambassador to the U.S. from Australia, both during the final year of the Obama administration and then also for 3 years under the Trump administration. So I'm sure a lot of those perspectives will be really interesting to our people that are joining us today. But you are also treasurer of Australia, which is an elected position, a member of parliament for several years. And then when I look at your minister list, the areas of expertise is incredible. Minister of Financial Services, Small Business and Tourism, Human Services and Employment and Workplace Relations. And in all that, you're also a lawyer, a husband, and the father of 3 children. So all those perspectives, I'm sure, are going to have a lot to add to the conversation today. So welcome.
Thanks, Amy. Great to be with you and with everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us.
Well, I should also add that you're a distinguished lecturer at American University with the Sine Institute, and I know the university has really appreciated you being a part of the work we're doing. So I really want to get into it with a question. You know, we were talking the other day, and I thought it was so interesting, your perspective, because you really kind of put it in context for me that we've had a history of crisis, certainly internationally, globally, you know, various countries, where you might have a health crisis that leads to a financial crisis. But one of the most unique things of what we're experiencing right now, you said, is they're happening simultaneously. So this is unique and causing some unique challenges as well.
Well, there's many unique aspects to this. It is, it's almost like a perfect storm. You've got 2 events occurring at the same time. You've got a massive health challenge, you've got an economic challenge, and it's global. So there's no safe haven here. During, for example, the global financial crisis, China and parts of Asia were safe haven. During SARS, America and parts of Europe were safe havens. So there was always somewhere to go. And of course, the other thing to understand about this crisis is that it wasn't caused by some event in the financial system, which is most familiar to most people in financial markets. There's no financial catastrophe that has caused the financial markets to calcify. And as a result, you've got the system that we're familiar with, but you know, has previously failed us and caused global downturns. That's in reasonable shape, but all the other systems that we've relied on have collapsed. And governments are torn about whether to deal with the health crisis first or the economic crisis. And of course, because it's not happening all at the same time everywhere in the world, there's different theories about how to address it.
All right, and so interconnected. I guess you brought up some great examples of some of the prior, you know, health crises. We've seen pandemics. Was the world not prepared for COVID? Should we have been more prepared for what we're dealing with right now from the health aspect?
Well, of course. I mean, there's been lots of people that have warned of the risk of a global pandemic and a flu-based pandemic for years. I was in cabinet. I remember when our health minister, would be like your secretary for health, insisted that we buy some vaccine, or in that situation it was vaccines for a particular disease, and spend $200 million on it. I said, well, why are we doing that? When will that ever happen? And he said, well, they last 5 years and it could happen. I was dismissive of it. I was paying the bills and I was dismissive of it. And I was wrong. And these are calls, that you make from time to time when you're in government about what your priority spending is. And unfortunately, many, many countries, there was certainly no preparation for a pandemic.
Well, I think the interesting thing from your financial perspective as well, and all the work that you did in Australia, looking at the markets and the trade that you've done, here in the United States, I guess the question is, as we're handling both of these simultaneously, let's talk about the stimulus projects that have been issued in response in the U.S. to this crisis. Do you think the CARES Act and some of the other things the Democrats and Republicans are working on right now will lend well to reassuring the markets, helping individuals as well with their own personal financial situation?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, I think there's going to be 3 rounds of stimulus. Broadly, the first stimulus packages are going to try to stabilize the economy. Mm-hmm. And what we've found is they've stabilized equity markets in part. They've stabilized some parts of the economy here. The US has also backfilled pretty significant gaping holes in its social fabric, like providing sick leave entitlements, about making sure that everyone can get to a hospital even if they don't have health insurance. That's backfilling the holes. And all that's trying to do is stabilize certain businesses. There has to be a second round of stimulus, and we're still in the first round. Right. There has to be a second round of stimulus that is going to try and get consumers to go back to spending money. Yeah. And they're only going to do that. They're not going to do it if you've got 20% unemployment. So somehow you need to get consumption going. And in the US, like many other Western economies, 2/3 of the economic growth each year comes from household expenditure. So if households aren't spending money, you haven't got growth, right? And then the third stimulus, which is further down the track, the third stimulus that the world, all economies are going to have, is trying to rebuild the infrastructure of growth. And that means investing in everything from broadband to bridges to roads to rail, investing in climate change, dealing with climate change, the things that are going to lift the productivity of the economies. So I think there's a long way to go until we get anywhere near the sort of growth that we had last year.
Well, it's interesting because it is a balance between, are you supporting small businesses, some of the industries that the United States counts on to generate, tourism, the restaurant industry, things that you need consumer confidence, as you mentioned as well, and trying to balance that with whatever money they're going to move to the states, they're trying to move to individuals. That all has to be happening.
Well, that's right. It all has to be happening at once. And, it really does come down to testing, because the vaccine is a long way away. People in big pharma tell me that, there hasn't been a vaccine for HIV or SARS or a range of other things. Don't automatically assume there's going to be a vaccine for the coronavirus. Secondly, it will take 12 to 18 months. I mean, it might get to market earlier, but it'll be a flawed pilot. So then you're saying, well, okay, what are we going to do? Try and find the drugs that alleviate the pain, will reduce the risk of death. That's all true. And there are many different, drugs in trial at the moment. But the big one is how, ask yourself this, how are you going to get people back onto cruise ships? Yeah. And the only way to do that is to have a test, like we have security screening at the airport. We have security screening to get on to ships, cruise ships. You've got to have a screening system that gives you an immediate result or a near immediate result on whether someone has coronavirus and not let them on the ship. And that is the only way you're going to reduce not only your real exposure, right, but as a lawyer, I wouldn't sign off on cruise ships going back out to sea unless the cruise company guaranteed everyone that there was no coronavirus on board. And it's the same with planes.
Still a lot of steps for us to get there. Certainly.
Oh, well, when you talk about 3, 4, 5 million tests, 10 million tests, here in the United States, 330 million people, many people are going to have multiple tests. I mean, you think about it, how would you ever get production going on a film set? How would you, it's only if you were absolutely sure all the actors and everyone on the film set was clear of coronavirus. And how would you ever get a factory floor going? Any interaction between human beings, you need to have that reassurance.
Thinking through all the industries, thinking through going to a sporting event or a concert,
sure.
how would you do that? And so there's a lot more to happen. I think we mentioned it before. One of the really interesting things is you've seen, the perspective of a Democratic administration in the United States, a Republican administration, two very different leadership styles with President Obama and President Trump. And we've actually talked about this a great deal, about the evolution of diplomacy in this modern world. And so much of what we talked about is the stimulus we have to do in the United States. But one of the things that's making this such a huge challenge is we're so interconnected globally as well. Whatever Italy decides or China decides or Australia decides to do, about coming in and out of its borders, or what they decide will certainly affect what the response is in other places. So does diplomacy matter in this response to the global pandemic? How is this playing out internationally, really, with other countries and their leaders?
Yeah, it's a good question. And insofar as when you had the financial crisis, the global financial crisis, there was no ready-made infrastructure available to help to get everyone to coordinate, and certainly the major economies to coordinate to repair the financial system. But at that time, President Bush and a number of other leaders got together and said, let's use the G20, because the G7 doesn't include China. It's basically Europe and North America. How do we get the key economies around the world involved? And the G20 was the mechanism. And it was already finance-based. I was the chair of the G20 in 2014.
I was going to ask, that was 2014 that you were chair.
Yeah, that's right. So I chaired the finance ministers and central bank governors of the G20. Australia was the host. And it was always originally the G20 about finance ministers and central bank governors. So I had Jack Lew and Janet Yellen as members of the committee I chaired. But then it morphed during the global financial crisis into a leadership group focused on addressing the global financial crisis. Now, the leadership group has continued, but what happened was, there's no secretariat. They should have convened the G20, at least by video, and they've done it a couple of times since. But try to have a coordinated global approach, a coordinated global shutdown. And whilst there's a fair chunk of the earth that has been in shutdown, here in DC, the rules about shutdown are different to what they are in New York and different to what they are in Ohio. How could you expect to get every country in the world, or even the major countries, agreeing to the same rules? And I think that was just too big an ask. So diplomacy let us down a bit. And the second thing, Amy, I have a very strong view that everything traditional, everything that is a precedent is out the door, and in the 21st century. And from my perspective, the most valuable tool between human beings and between countries and between businesses is trust. And if you have trust, then you can start to rebuild relationships. And, the first question I ask, if I've been in isolation for 14 days and the family next door with 3 kids has been in isolation for 14 days, after 14 days, why can't we start to mix? At some point, we've got to open. I trust them. I trust that they've been loyal to all the procedures and expectations. We've been loyal to. At some point, we have to trust them. We have to trust the school that will tell us if there's a breakout. We have to trust the hospital. We have to trust. And trust is so important.
It is.
Going forward.
It is. And that's the question, because if it becomes every country for themselves, what does that mean for the future of these multilateral institutions? And, and like you mentioned before to me, the Bretton Woods alliances, is that possible in this diplomatic future you're talking about? I mean, if the trust,
it's interesting.
How are we going to be able to trust through these decisions with the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I've got a client that wants to engage in a corporate takeover in Australia.
Mhm.
And they said to me, the first question they're going to be asked by their shareholders is, have you met the company chief executive in Australia? He said, how would I do that? And I said, well, that's a little challenging. I mean,
Yeah,
it's going
yeah.
to be a Zoom engagement, because if you fly to Australia, they put you in a hotel room for 14 days. They lock the door, and they deliver you your food and your sheets, and that's it, right? But still, you can fly as an Australian into the US, whereas the US won't accept people from Europe, still won't accept people from Europe, a number of other countries. So, how do we get that trusting relationship going? And it's not going to be traditional alliances or traditional methods. We're going to be looking for friends that we can trust.
So in your role, certainly then as ambassador, do you think those roles and those diplomatic roles with secretaries of states and ambassadors can help pave that way?
Absolutely. I think diplomacy generally has thankfully skipped the second half of the 20th century, where the phone and media reporting and everything else had all the answers, and it came down to the relationships an individual would have with someone. In the 1940s and early 50s, and in the 1800s in Europe, of course, the ambassador, as the representative of another leader, would have a relationship with the president, in those days, the kings and queens, of those countries. And that went in the second half of the 20th century, because people were getting more immediate news through the media. They were getting the latest information. There was, a fire hydrant of information flying. I had a personal relationship with President Obama when I was chair of the G20. So that's when I first met President Obama, and various visits to Australia and so on. But when I came here, I also worked hard on developing a relationship with President Trump, a personal relationship. And it's rare. It's very rare for an ambassador to be in that sort of position. And, you've just got to try and have those one-on-one relationships now so that they trust you. It comes back to, do they trust you?
To that trust piece.
Yeah.
Well, since none of us can really travel anywhere, why don't you and I have a virtual travel a little bit around the world for a minute and talk about different regions and the response. Obviously, I've been fortunate, we've talked about this, to have been able to go to Australia. You brought up, some of the work that you did when you were there, and what it's like to go back and forth now. I have to ask, with the bushfires, something so difficult, for the Australian people, do you think that better prepared the country's response for COVID-19, or do you think it was a detriment and left a little bit of vulnerability? Certainly, because this also didn't happen in a vacuum for all these countries. They were dealing with different crises as well.
Well, that's right. And look, in politics, I've been in leadership positions in politics. And, you don't get all wisdom and knowledge through the air conditioning in the office.
Yeah.
You actually have to, you learn from your experience.
Right.
And if you've never been in the thick of a crisis, then you tend to make the mistakes that those before you made. So in the case of the bushfires, there's been an argument made that the federal government wasn't as prepared as it could have been. And that's because it's an event, bushfires occur every year, but these were, devastating bushfires, much greater than anyone would have expected. And because they were not as prepared as they perhaps should have been, the public was very hard on them. So as the coronavirus was emerging, the Prime Minister was well ahead of the pack and said, look, I'm not going to have another event, where I'm not ready, and put in place, for example, early isolation from China, which China is Australia's biggest trading partner. There's 1 million Chinese-speaking citizens in Australia out of 26 million. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese students, they restricted in getting back into Australia. And, the universities went nuts. The media, parts of the media went nuts. People were going, are you crazy? He went early and he went hard. Right. Now, New Zealand did exactly the same. And New Zealand went hard early, and to their great credit. Now, the number of deaths in Australia out of 26 million is around 70.
Yeah.
which is
It's
very low.
unbelievable. Yeah.
You know,
And when you see the numbers globally, when we see the press conferences every day here in the United States, it's a stark contrast. In
yeah,
a lot of
and you know, but every country is different. But yes, if you have a crisis, then you know how to respond to a crisis. And look, it's better to overreact than to underreact. That's the great lesson in politics. Here you are, everyone. One of lesson 309 that I learned painfully. Better to overreact than to underreact to a crisis.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned New Zealand as well, because for Australia, its border is really with New Zealand, but otherwise an isolated, continent where it's not, connected to various countries.
Well,
Then let's move to Europe for a minute. I mean, because
well,
Europe's
just before you
response.
do,
Yes.
I mean, you know, Papua New Guinea, just north of Australia, about 8 million people, has the highest HIV rates in the world. Even the Prime Minister now is in isolation because of coronavirus, which is, you know, it's a horrific scenario up there. They had the view, that government, that no, it'll be all right. And then Indonesia, just to our north, which, you know, has 240 million people living on 17,000 islands. The vice president there said early on that God will take care of us, don't worry about it. Now it is potentially Armageddon in Indonesia. And then you go right through the Asia area. Even Singapore is having a huge blowback now. They've done really well, but, you know, they rely a lot on imported labor. Mm-hmm. And they're now having a huge surge in Singapore of new cases and so on. So, you know, there's lots of lessons.
Lots of lessons there. And I think we'll be able to map out the different responses and then what happened to citizens in those countries. We were going to kind of move to Europe because we see the type of devastation and challenges in Italy and Spain. Was there a regional response, do you think, in Europe, or a lack thereof? What contributed to the challenges that Europe faced early on, especially?
Well, I think the biggest challenge in Europe is trying to work out who's in charge. Yeah. And that's something that, you know, they've been tearing themselves apart with for years now, as the coordinated EU is trying to get more and more power. Question is whether Brussels runs the shop or not. And you have open borders, but yet you have, you know, an influx of refugees from Syria and Africa, Northern Africa, and so on. So I think that's, you know, it's a big question even here, isn't it?
Yeah.
In charge. Yeah. And if you don't know who's in charge, then when they exercise power, they're unsure about whether it's going to be applied or not. So, you know, Europe has many, many different factors. In Italy, of course, Milan region has a lot of Chinese workers in the textile area, and a lot of them came back, and some of them were carrying the virus. And of course, in Italy, you've got 3 generations living in one house in a number of different houses. Similarly in Spain, whereas in other parts of Europe, you've got single-person households representing 50% of the population. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the spread is different, and the speed of the spread. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the EU overall. And I think, you know, the Germans tend to think that everyone should carry their own weight. The Italians are thinking that the Germans should carry some of the Italian weight. And, you know, it's only relatively recently that Germany opened up a vast number of beds because, as you know, I mean, during the first Iraq War, Germany was the first point for casualties from the war for Americans. So they built a lot of ICU facilities up there, and the Germans opened them up to the Italians and the French, and that created some goodwill and addressed some of the increasing nationalism that is a real threat in Europe and all over the world.
You bringing up the EU, it is a good question, especially for individuals who might not be following this globally as much and very focused on their own individual experience. You know, is the EU playing a role? Are they trying to do a regional? Are they taking a leadership role in this, or should they more so? You know, what I know that there's certainly with England, you know, leaving the EU, there's questions about its strength in the region, but it seems like that would be one of the pillars or one of the things that you would want to do in a global crisis. The EU should step up and help have a regional response. Are we seeing that?
Well, you'd think you would, but I mean,
Yeah.
it's all pretty fractured, Europe. I mean, Switzerland has one of the highest per capita rates in the world of the coronavirus. And they, you think, do have the capacity to close their borders.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to see a lot of pressure on politicians in Europe to start having border patrols.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not only, you know, there was a lot of pressure with the refugee debate. There's going to be even more pressure now with coronavirus, because the coronavirus is just going to keep going like a wave around the world. Some countries in Northern Europe are just engaging in herd immunity, which is kind of extraordinary. Others are able to implement, because national security really is a national issue, not an EU issue. Some other countries are able to implement community policing and isolationism in a way that perhaps some in America would dream of. So, you know, it's just the fact that this is not something that's tested politics before on this scale or in this way.
And for the global financial response, is it for others, you know, like I said, not paying as much attention to what's happening globally? Are we seeing these huge numbers of unemployed and industries shutting down? And is there a similar stimulus type thing, you know, packages being put together in other countries as well? I mean, it would seem to be a part of that. So,
well, I mean, they say, look, you know, I saw a Brookings blog that said, if employers, and they did some analysis during the GFC here in the US, and they found that if employers laid off their employees, then it took a lot longer for that employee or that former employee to get back into the workforce than if they'd furloughed them, stood them down, and been able to bring them back. The American stimulus lends itself to laying off people, in my view, more so than the wage subsidy, which applies in Australia, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, a few other countries. The wage subsidy is you basically give the employer the money to employ someone for, in Australia's case, 6 months.
okay.
At up to, you know, I think $100,000 of wages. And that means you're keeping the employer and employee attached to each other. They've still got, in America's case, they still have their health insurance, but they have their pension schemes, they have their sick leave entitlements, they have the security that they've still got an attachment to their employer. So if it does go for a shorter period of time, they know they've got a job, because the employer is stuck with them through thick and thin. So they're more likely to go out and spend money. Whereas if they're, you know, their first point of call is the unemployment office, then apart
They're
from
making different financial choices, right?
And there's a humiliation aspect to it as well. And, you know, I mean, we've got to try and hold together the community until the health crisis has passed. Don't forget, this was all about the hump. And the hump was, I mean, we've lost sight of that. Everyone's looking for zero coronavirus, but it was never intended to be about that. It was always intended not to flood the, you know, intensive care units of our hospitals with people that couldn't get treatment. And so when you come through the hub, you need to have a proper conversation about opening doors, about getting people back to work. I think it's really important. Otherwise, we will go into not only depression, a very deep and enduring depression, certainly for the second half of this year.
And I think it's interesting because not only in the United States, but globally, it's not just about putting processes in place to open back up. There's got to be a confidence from people that they can then, you know, when are they going to want to go to a restaurant again? When are they going to want to participate and invest in some of the things they used to and economically spend on? So a lot of that is trying to get the confidence level up of individuals as well.
And Amy, I mean, you've had a lot of experience in politics, probably more than me. But you know, the two biggest drivers in the community, and the two biggest drivers of human reaction, are hope and fear.
Yeah.
Or hope or fear. And when you drive, you know, fear, telling people to get into their homes, to go into hibernation, fearing walking down the street without a mask on, even to the point where people don't say hello. I mean, I walk down the street and say hello. First person I see in, you know, 5 minutes, and they don't even say hello. Maybe it's my appearance, but I don't know. It's like, I'm no threat. And I'm thinking, hang on, what's going on here, right? So you've got to try and get, you know, the turtle will never come out of its shell until it is absolutely sure that it's safe to poke its head at, right? And I think in this instance, we're in a position where, you know, you have to move from the fear, which is understandably driven by all the health officials, and politicians as well. You need to get to that hope. Otherwise, there's no recovery in prospect.
And it's a part of the process, like that is literally one of the pieces to the puzzle to getting to the other side. It's interesting. We had a question that somebody sent in that I'd love to touch base with you on while we're here in Europe. They asked the question, it seemed like early on the US and London had a very similar response that was much more open and, you know, maybe certainly not as you know, cautious in the very early stages, and then certainly, you know, went into you know, a mode that was definitely looking at staying in place. You know, the advice from the administration and the CDC and Dr. Fauci to you know, do this. And then they said, and it's interesting that London has made different recent choices. You know, and so how do you see the response, the U.S. and England, and as similar, and where it was different in some of these? And does having your prime minister actually suffering from, you know, does that change the dynamic at all? Certainly. Well, having firsthand experience.
I mean, I'll say what others think, and thank God Boris Johnson, you know, recovered well, because if anything else had happened, it would have been a devastating morale blow to the whole world. And you know, there have been some great stories about recovery, even from really, you know, intense infliction. Of course, the UK is closer to Europe, and Italy was the first in Europe, and it was acute, and it happened fast. And France wasn't that far behind, and a number of other countries, which people haven't talked about, were there. So, you know, UK had, you know, the right on their doorstep with, you know, still pretty much open borders.
Right.
They had the acute story about coronavirus. And the United States lagged that lesson. And, you know, it wasn't just, you know, about the president of the United States. I mean, you know, others of all sides of politics were urging people to keep going out and go to restaurants and so on, right? So, you know, and it's 2020 hindsight's a beautiful thing. But the UK also has incredible powers. Some of them are legacies from World War II. And about, you know, we're all in it together. We all need to contribute. We all need to lock away. They've had bombings in the city of London. They've had bombings in other parts of the UK that have tuned them into that, to reacting when the government says, yes, we need to react. The second key thing is they have an integrated health system. The NHS is the biggest single health system in the world. And so the big thing is that when there's a breakout in a particular area, because it is an integrated health system, they are able to know where masks are, where gowns are. They've already got inventories, or they can force a hospital to give them inventories and get it into the system. Australia has a combined private and public health system, much like the US, but it's integrated. And therefore, the governor of New South Wales, the equivalent of the governor, the premier, within 2 weeks was able to find where gowns and ventilators were, even if they were in private hospitals. I've been watching, you know, Governor Cuomo here, And he's been effectively trying to rebuild or build an integrated health system in New York State at the same time he's trying to address the coronavirus. And it's nigh impossible to do that because some hospitals, which have no particular link to the state or deep reliance on the state of New York, they're going, well, hang on, I've got a link with this private health insurance company. If I don't have ventilators and gowns and so on, I'm not going to get that contract again next year, right? So I'm not going to tell you what I got. And you know, that's been a real battle.
A big barrier.
Trying to find out what the inventory is. And if they can't find it out in a state, how the hell can they find it out for the whole country? It's very challenging.
It is challenging. We've seen that kind of play out. And we can talk about that when we go to lessons learned as well. But you brought up earlier with diplomacy, the trust factor. And so maybe we can travel a little to China, because I think, you know, the question is a lot is, did we learn early lessons from the response in China? I think some of the data coming out now says that there was a different, you know, information about how many original cases they were. So what were the lessons in response from China early on? I mean, was there some mistrust in some places that you know, didn't help the situation to learn more from what was happening early on there?
Yeah, it's absolute mistrust from many other countries around the world. And I don't know, it'll take a long time for China to recover that. And I think they're making some effort now, but still it's very hard to believe. And you know, it's related to the fact that, you know, one of the biggest issues it's a very big part of Chinese culture is face. You know, to save face, not to be embarrassed by people, not to embarrassed by behavior on your own side, etc. Whereas, you know, Western countries like the US and Australia, we just blur it all out, right? It's like on the news, right? There's no holds barred. Whereas China, it's
24/7, constant.
24/7, yeah. God bless Twitter, right? So it's sort of like, okay, well, you know, in China, it's everything about control and face. And because they tried to control the coronavirus, it was all about saving face. No, we got it under control. Mm-hmm. There was this deep level of mistrust. And of course, they wouldn't let all the people in that were meant to go in to find out what was going on. Therefore, there was false information coming out. The alert system didn't work. There's no doubt the World Health Organization should have done more, and they've made a number of mistakes along the way. I agree with that. But, you know, I mean, we all make mistakes from time to time. But, you know, that I think, you know, it was handled badly, and it's done enormous damage to China's international reputation. Mm-hmm. And no amount of you know, Belt and Road funding or funding for, you know, bilateral aid is going to make up for the lack of trust. And as I said to you, trust is everything. Yeah. Between countries, between peoples. And if you can't trust the source country of the virus, then it's going to be a very long time till that's rebuilt. And there'll be consequences. Of course there'll be consequences.
Well, it's interesting because it makes me ask, like, if there's this lack of trust, what is the impact that COVID-19 will have on the China-US relationship, understanding that you, who have represented Australia so well, Australia is caught between the two, right? So how is this going to play out going forward when you've also worked with two different administrations who took different approaches on that, whether it's you know, the diplomacy part or trade, or, you know, definitely trust is going to play a factor, but what's the future for that relationship?
Well, I look around me here in Washington, D.C. and see that China is virtually friendless, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. There's just, you know, no one's there saying, look, don't be too hard on China. They're a really important part of the world economy. I'm not hearing that anyway. You know, that's one of the bipartisan things, you know, one of the very few bipartisan things here in DC. And I expect there's going to be a bidding war in the lead up to the November election between, you know, Vice President Biden and President Trump and a whole range of other people, a bidding war for who can be toughest on China. whether it be about the supply lines for critical goods. I mean, you know, in the United States, you have a law that says someone in the military has to wear a uniform that can only be made in America, whereas if they're injured, they're going to get an antibiotic that every single antibiotic here has ingredients either and only either from China or India or both. So hang on, how's that work?
Yeah.
And so I think there's going to be a nationalisation of supply lines, and countries like Australia, the UK, Canada are hoping that the United States includes trusted partners in that supply line. Because if the United States goes it alone, then China will pick up the slack, and others will pick up the slack in one form or another. We don't want the United States to become an isolationist country. No. Similarly, I think, you know, China is going to have to work really hard to rebuild trust in its supply lines. There are many countries in the world, and China's not excluded from that, where the first thing you do is take care of your people. And if you've got supply of a critical mineral or you know, PPE or anything else, first thing you do is you take care of your people. And that's, you know, understandable, but it's also nationalistic, and you know, it threatens other countries, and takes us very regrettably back to you know, the horrible lessons of the mid-1930s involving Japan, where they were cut off from food and oil and they decided to go and get it another way. And we don't want to create that sort of environment.
Well, it's interesting because as you're talking about this health finance balance that we're doing simultaneously as well, it's interesting because you've seen this dynamic between science and politics and government, like all, you know, what is the role of the expert, you know, here and what is it in other countries? These scientists have come forward, like, who are we trusting? You know, what experts are we, you know, looking to kind of help guide us through this?
Yeah, well, on the trust scale, you know, doctors are up there, scientists are pretty much up there. And then I think Polly's, as I was one, was, you know, down there, occasionally below journalists. And or, you know, either way, it was a bit of an arm wrestle. But, you know, the fact is people want to know what the expert advice is. And the challenge is that in this pandemic, there's no black or white, you know, there's various shades of grey, and about how to deal with the coronavirus. And naturally enough, doctors and scientists will say you've got to have virtually no cases in order to guarantee it won't come back. Totally understandable.
Right.
Because no doctor wants to say, look, you know, you're going to get sick, bad luck, because you never know what the implications are with this virus. So, you know, it's a balancing act, big balancing act.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because before, when you were talking about that balance between hope and fear, you know, a question that I really thought that I wanted to bring up with you is, like, what is the importance of controlling the narrative? So what is that balance between reality and reassurance that our leaders are trying to find, you know, in this time? I mean,
well, it's really challenging because, you know, a lot of people get it wrong. I mean, at first, when Churchill became Prime Minister and his armies were heading to Dunkirk and basically going to wipe out all the British army in Europe, he was trying to reassure the British people that all was not lost, but it was going to be.
Yeah.
And then, you know, you have to ease people into it unless there is a catastrophic event. It takes time to ease, you know, people into the you know, it takes a moment, it takes time to turn them from hope to fear. In Australia, you know, just night after night of horrible bushfire visuals, which went around the world, that turned, you know, the hope of a great summer into the fear of the summer and the looming, you know, got people out of their homes to safe havens. It takes a while to change human behaviour. And once you're in the fear mode, it takes a while to get the hope back. So, but, you know, honesty is hugely, hugely important. You know, you've got to be straight with people, and also not go down the path of saying, you said on such and such a date. Well, it's okay to reflect that someone said something on a date past, as long as you provide the context around what they were saying about the information they had when they made that statement. I mean, a lot of people take previous comments, and I'm applying this to all political parties. I'm not showing any preference, but, you know, I often found, to my frustration in Australian politics, someone would take completely out of context what I said a year ago or 2 years ago and apply it to today's circumstances. You know, that's brutal in politics. Everyone's guilty of it, but it's just wrong. And so what you've got to do is just say, look, I'm being as honest as possible. And you know what? If people believe you're being honest, and you are being honest, they'll trust you. They'll trust you. But if they feel that you're spinning them for your own benefit, they won't trust you. Simple as that.
So you were in Parliament, was it like 17 years? So I think that was, and certainly Treasurer of Australia is an elected position as well. I have to ask, as a former elected official, when do you listen to experts around you, and when do you challenge them? I mean, when should you challenge them and you know, question? Because as an elected official, sometimes you're the only one who's getting every part of the conversation to process it.
I'm a great believer in, you know, private advice and public support. That's always been my mantra, right? So, you know, the smartest people I've ever met are the ones that have the best advice around them and recognise that they're not the smartest. They're the smartest people.
Winning combination, right?
Yeah, that's right. You get the best advice you can, you weigh it all up, and you make a decision.
Yeah. And
it might be the wrong decision, but the worst thing you can do if you're in power is not exercise power. So, you know, that's my experience. I was a minister for, you know, I was basically a minister from 1998 to 2000 you know, 15, and over that time, you know, I was a decision maker, whether it be, you know, running the welfare system, running a health system, running the economy, the Australian economy, and you know, and there were lots of critics, but the thing you have to do is not be afraid to make a decision, and you get the best advice, and I think that builds trust.
Well, it's interesting too, because something we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about is we are seeing this dynamic play out right now in the United States, where our state and federal government is coming into play, and decisions made about authority. We'd like to say this is a great civics lesson, you know, that we're going through during the pandemic as well. But you do see governors say, you know, make decisions regionally. So it's interesting as we're seeing this play out, and trying to understand where those lines are drawn. Is it something similar in Australia? Are there some of those challenges between the national government and then more localized government? And have there been examples where maybe during the bushfires they came together in a really positive way?
Well, yeah, and they've also made mistakes. So you know, there's been some celebrated mistakes as well. I wouldn't, you know, hold Australia up as a perfect example, because there is none. But you know, what the Prime Minister did on this occasion, because it was the whole nation affected, he called together a new cabinet of all the state leaders, no matter what political persuasion they were, and himself. And he called it the National Cabinet. And it meets by video once a week. And now you can't do that with 50 governors, but you can try in one form or another. But having that collective input, and you know, there's only 6 states and 2 territories in Australia, so it's easier to do. But the collective input and able to share stories and war stories is really, really important. But you know, this has been a confusing period. You know, in Victoria, one state of Australia, you know, a man was fined for visiting his wife's grave on Easter Sunday. And the community was appalled at that. Yeah. And the police then announced, hang on, you know, we've gone too far. You can go to the beach in one part of Sydney, but not in another part.
Yeah.
And, you know, I had it here in DC. I went up to the Giant to do the shopping. They said, you can't come in without a face mask. I said, but hang on, the President of the United States said I don't have to wear a face mask. And they said, yeah, but the mayor of DC is more
The
powerful.
mayor of DC did, so yeah.
And she said, you have to wear a face mask. You're not coming in without a face mask. So I'm like, who's running this joint? Right? It's obviously the mayor of DC is. So,
Yeah.
you know, there's no obvious, playbook here.
Right.
The thing is, as long as everyone's pushing in the same direction, that's what really matters.
Well, I think the other, and this is a question from Elliot, who's one of our strong Sine supporters who goes to a lot of our programming, but he asked online, and I think it's important, another really good way that's going to show itself this year is, in Australia, there's compulsory voting, but I think that's going to be the next big test of this federal versus the states. We've got a national election this year. We've seen it play out in our Wisconsin primary. This question around access to voting, how this vote will happen, campaigning, put even that aside, like how are we going to campaign when some of the traditional norms aren't there? Like, how do you think, what measures do you think the U.S. should ensure so that people can safely vote? What do you think how that's going to play out in this year?
Well, I'm reluctant to give that sort of advice, but I think you said to me the other day, there are 19,000 different voting systems.
9,000 different
9,000.
Localized, yeah.
Yeah. And in Australia, you have one voting system for national elections. And then you have for state elections, different voting system. And then for more local elections, they're the same as in each state.
Yeah.
So we've got two systems, really. And for a national election, just one system. And it's compulsory voting as well. So, it's a different kettle of fish. And everyone wants you to vote, right? Whereas here, not everyone wants people to vote. And, my view is in a democracy, you should encourage everyone to vote. That's what lots of people died for, the right for us to vote. And if we choose not to vote, then don't vote for any of the candidates, but still vote somehow. I don't know. You can do something. But I just think for us, it's really important that everyone gets the chance to vote and given equal opportunity to vote,
right?
To get the best outcome for the country. So, postal voting works really well in Australia.
Absolutely. I was going to ask, like, if that's a strong system for you. So.
Yeah, it works really well. In fact, I think it's now a majority of people don't vote on polling day in Australia, but we have compulsory voting, so they vote before polling day, and in various different ways. And look, you asked me the question, but you haven't done it. But I know it's coming. About who's going to win with Trump or Biden. Let me tell you, everything depends on what happens between now and the end of the year. I think a lot will depend on whether the coronavirus comes back, and if it's more virulent when it comes back in the northern winter, and how it's handled. I mean, this will come right down to the wire about the messaging of the two candidates.
Yeah.
And people will, ultimately, when there's God forbid, 20% unemployment, if there's, more deaths associated with coronavirus, self-interest will be an absolutely powerful tool in this.
Yeah, and as an elected official, there's less than 200 days before people start voting here in the States, but a million different scenarios will happen. It seems like a lot of time. Then for operatives, it seems like so little time. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in the fall. I have this friend, Joe, who talks about the coronavirus period as the before time, and we're in the during time, and then she mentions in the after time. And sometimes she'll say to me, like, what do you want to do in the after time? I guess I want to ask you, like, what do you think the future does look like? I mean, are there things that we're learning now that can better prepare us? Are there things that we might even be better at? Like, what do you talk about the hope and fear too. Like, what is the next steps? What does it look like as we move forward?
I'm really hoping the world will be a better place. I think it will be. I'm celebrating the end of populism for the moment. I mean, it would have been popular as a lot of leaders did around the world, to ignore the coronavirus, to say it's just another flu, but that died, and they made unpopular decisions to close their countries. They're still making unpopular decisions, yes, in one case or another. And I celebrate that. I hate hearing opinion polls, especially during these days. when they're so misleading, because they're, you know, I think we'll also discover more about ourselves, about what our priorities are in life.
Yeah.
I mean, I had deer, 3 deer out the front of the house here in the middle of the other day. I posted it on Instagram, and I'm just going, hang on, you know, that's fantastic. People are seeing kangaroos come into the middle of cities, and you know, and you're starting to hear about the great stories about the waterways in Venice, and you know, maybe Mother Nature really needed a bit of a break from humanity, and we've given it. And you reflect on that, and I think, you know, we can do. I mean, it might not help the airlines, but maybe we can do more communication with people, you know, through Zoom or Skype or whatever it might be, without having to get on a plane and travel. But we're still not walking away from the human relationship. And, you know, maybe we'll learn that trust really does matter. And, you know, you've got to work out who the good people are in your life and who the evil people are, and not, you know, get past the facade and look deep into their hearts.
Yeah. In an interesting way, it's almost like in some respects we had to become so isolated to be connected in some ways. And so we'll see how that, you know, plays out. And I like to watch, especially on the evening news, these aspirational stories. You know, we applaud certainly our frontline, our medical, our grocery store, you know, workers, all the people who are risking things to make sure that we have what we need. And so, you know, maybe we will look differently at just, you know, how these individuals, you know, supply things for us to make our life better. And
we are learning about a whole new cohort of heroes.
Yes.
And normally you expect the heroes to be the soldier in the battlefield, or even the doctor, you know, in the ICU. But, you know, it's all the people around there. And, you know, what about the godforsaken, you know, people that are running funeral businesses? I mean, they're heroes for what they're going through. Traumatizing, you know. So every aspect of the community, stacking the shelves at Giant, whatever it might be, we're learning about a whole new breed of heroes, and hopefully makes us appreciate them more every day.
Well, Joe, I have to say thank you so much. I will say this, you are a distinguished lecturer with us at the Sine Institute. We had so many questions left in the queue that we would love to invite you back to do one of these while we're in our isolated, connected phase. But we really look forward to the day that you're coming on campus and spending time with our students and getting to share all of your experiences with them. And I think in a great way, you help for a lot of us who are going through the day-to-day kind of get that global perspective in a lot of respects. And so we really appreciate your time today. And we look forward to having a additional conversation with you. And, you know, sharing just as we move forward, and maybe it's even checking in a little while, because this will change several times still before we see any kind of resolution. We don't know, you know, we look back a month ago and I don't think we could have foreseen some of the things that we're, you know, dealing with. So it'll be very interesting as we kind of move forward into the after time. So
thanks, Amy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Joe.